South. Um, and it's really an important part of this, and really part of the most the most important part of this is, as I go through the leaders that I've chosen here, you'll see that by and large they are all graduates of West Point. The military leaders that I've chosen are, let me get this to scroll down here. For the South are Johnston, who are cousins, and there's Stonewall Jackson, which you may have heard about. There's Jeb Stuart, Longstreet down here, and General Lee. Now, there are, of course, many other generals and many other important commanders and officers during the Civil War. I've picked these guys out for some of my own reasons, but for good historic reasons. I'll start off with Jeb Stuart, and again, I want to point out that, as I have said already, these guys are, by and large, graduates of West Point. All of them are, nearly all of them are. It's a big, important part of the Civil War for this reason. They know each other. The Southerners know the Southerners. They know the Northerners. Think about this. They went to school, in many cases, together at West Point. West Point at the time was 5 years, and they went to school all the time during the summer. They didn't get breaks off. Now, Jeb Stuart really pioneers. The reason I've chosen Jeb Stuart is that Stuart really pioneers the notion of cavalry. Up until this point, warfare has been Napoleonic style, and it's been march out into a field and shoot at each other, and whoever's left standing gets to choose who won the battle. Because the Southerners are so short on supplies, including men, Stuart really is brilliant in that he organizes the first stages of cavalry. And cavalry to an army is important because it gives it mobility. You're on horses and you can be mobile. So Stuart becomes, as Lee says, and you may hear this in the movie Gettysburg, he is his eyes and ears. And Stuart effectively goes up and down those northern or mid-Appalachians, the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, effectively protecting his troops from the northern troops. And secondly, he can choose when he wants to engage the northern enemy. Unfortunately for the South, he's killed in 1864, and of him Lee said he never brought me a false report. He was invaluable to Lee and the Southern cause, which is why they were really kept the war going until right after the Battle of Gettysburg. Longstreet, too, is a graduate of West Point. He's featured prominently in the Battle of Gettysburg. He lives through the war, and down here, I find this really interesting. Down here, he becomes, it's quite interesting, he becomes part of the Republican Party, which is pretty interesting if you're thinking about it. And he became friends with Grant after the war, served as minister to Turkey, and he really bridges the gap to the 20th century. So think about this. This is pretty amazing at the time because, McKinley and the Roosevelt era, this is the 1900s. This is the 20th century here. So he lives to be a good old man and is very successful in a political career as well. Stonewall Jackson, if you ask people about Southern generals, first comes to mind normally. He gets the name Stonewall during First Manassas when the troops notice that he is as steady as a stone wall, that he does not retreat. Unfortunately, earlier, so to speak, in the war, at the Battle of Chancellorsville down here, he is shot by his own men. Now, how this happens here, down here, is that there are, at every battle, at the end of the day, to figure out who is left and your position, you send out at night pickets. And pickets are designed, and their job is to move around stealthily at night and figure out where the enemy is and their strength. Well, General Jackson makes a mistake, essentially, and he rides forward to do his own reconnaissance. He is riding back at dusk, so he rides into his own pickets. They, thinking that he is enemy, shoot him. He doesn't die directly from his wounds, although they have to amputate his arm. He dies from being laid up so long that he dies eventually of pneumonia. The Confederacy. He is a great gentleman, an earlier graduate of West Point, so that makes him quite a bit older than his generals that he works with very successfully. And generally is a very sad story. Of all of the people that are involved in this great war, who are maligned as Confederates, and I guess we all must consider them as Confederates, General Lee, if you look here, General Lee married Mary Custis, and she was the daughter of Washington Parker Custis, which makes her the great or granddaughter of Martha Washington. So of all people, General Lee is American. And it's a very sad story that, of course, when he decided to go with the Southern Army, it was a very difficult decision for him to make. And he labored over it. It wasn't easy. But people maligned him in the North. People maligned him and hated him as being a traitor. A sad part of the story is that their big plantation, their mansion, sits right across the river, Potomac River, from Washington. And their plantation is named Arlington. And as retribution, as bitter punishment, the Northern soldiers took over that plantation, and Mr. General Lee's wife fled, and they ransacked the house, and all sorts of artifacts from Washington and Martha Washington were lost to history, including the bedclothing that Washington died in, apparently. In any event, if you go to Arlington National Cemetery today, you'll see that it is enormous, and you'll see this big house on the hill. And as punishment, so to speak, the Union Army began burying Civil War dead on his front lawn, literally. Lee did surrender at Appomattox. He wasn't the general for the entire war. He became general-in-chief after Johnston's death early in the war. And even after the war, I can't say that he was unrepentant, but his feeling about the Confederacy was very difficult to rationalize for himself. And make sure that you read this quote, because he felt that even though there's no out clause in the Constitution, that if the government was not doing what they should do, then it was the duty of the states to change that, and he saw this as the only way out from that. To go to the key military figures for the North. The story here of the North is one of absolute chaos for the first part of the war. I should go last first, but what really happens here is the North has 9 different commanders during the course of the war, whereas the South has 2. So that's very telling in and of itself if you change leaders that many times. First leader is General Winfield Scott, and he is renowned as a hero of both the War of 1812 and the Mexican War. But as you've heard me tell the anecdote, he is over 300 pounds. He's an older man at the beginning of the Civil War. He has trouble getting on a horse. In fact, he needs a ladder to get on. And he realizes very, very quickly that this is not for him and quickly retires. Excuse me. Lincoln appoints General George McClellan, who is a younger man. Now, start looking here. He is a graduate of West Point. He, like many of these men are civil engineers. They're topographers. Their major, if you will, at West Point was the ground. And if you were a cavalry or an officer, a cavalryman, the ground that you're going to be fighting on is very important. Now, McClellan disappoints tremendously Lincoln twice. He, after Manassas won, retreats to Washington to defend it, which is a good cause. But he spends months and months and months preparing to defend and preparing for battle, but never actually goes out and takes on the enemy, all the while a much weaker South is building forces. Lincoln urges McClellan to go out and fight, and he declines. Lincoln fires him, and replaces him with a succession of generals. Now, I will go through that succession later, but I want to point out some of them, and they are not necessarily in the order. General Pope is one of these generals, and again, if you notice, he is, as all of these men are, graduate of West Point, topographical engineer, veteran Mexican War. He is a brave man and a failed general. General Ambrose, and again, graduate West Point, is well known through his exploits in the Mexican War. What is interesting about him is you cannot escape, by looking at this picture, these massive lamb chops right here. And during the war, his men made fun of him, and at that time you called this growth lamb chops. They turned his name around and called him Sideburns. Maybe not to his face. But he too was replaced, but goes on to have a good political career as governor of Rhode Island and senator from Rhode Island. General Hooker is quick also as the leader and the chief in command of the Union Army, and he is, as his name implies, his brief leadership is tainted with combination of drinking, and he is said to have had a brothel follow him on the battlefield, which was not necessarily unknown at the time. George Meade. George Meade is a general who is, by default, actually the victor at Gettysburg. It's not so much that Meade wins the battle at Gettysburg, but on the third day, of course, Lee makes the decision to have Pickett charge across the wheat field. Men get mowed down, and really by virtue of that decision on Lee's part, the Union wins the battle at Gettysburg. Meade makes a fatal decision and decides not to chase the Army of Virginia. And this infuriates Lincoln. Lincoln replaces him with General Grant. General Grant is well known because he has won the Western Theater. Out of absolute oblivion, so to speak, Grant is a great story. In 1859, he is, by all today's standards, a drunk. He is down and out. His wife has moved away because they cannot afford to live together. And he works in a leather shop. In 7 years, he becomes president of the United States. Lincoln likes him because he's a battlefield leader, and he says this man wins. So after Gettysburg, Grant comes in and becomes the commander-in-chief. He goes on, of course, to become president 2 terms. We'll talk about this a little later in the next unit. But although is deemed to be a good president, his administration is corrupt. He doesn't have great people in his administration. General Sherman replaces Grant in the Western Theater. General Sherman goes on to be commander-in-chief during Grant's presidency and is in charge of the future Plains Indian Wars. Sherman, if you mention Sherman in the South, he is reviled because of his so-called March to the Sea. It was the Northern strategy to cut now the Southern Confederacy in half, west to east. So having won the Mississippi, Sherman marches to the Atlantic, cutting a swath through the Confederacy. And in front of him, also, the Southerners burned everything and took everything that could have possibly have been in use for Sherman. So that is always remembered in the South. I throw in General Custer here because even though he's a youngster, and you can see up here that he is graduated from West Point in 1861, he's a hellion. He essentially graduated, not essentially, he graduated last in his class, was known for playing pranks, yet became a particularly good leader in the field. He is breveted 2 or 3 times, which means he gets a battlefield promotion. And you can see that here in this picture he has 2 stars of a general. And we probably know him better because he was killed in the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana against the Plain Indians in 1876. For sure, Custer had eyes on the White House. There is no doubt of that. Joshua Chamberlain is, and I don't hero worship, Joshua Chamberlain is a bona fide hero in my book. Joshua Chamberlain and his brother Thomas volunteer for the Army during the Civil War. They have no military experience. If you look here, he speaks 9 languages fluently: Greek, Latin, Spanish, German, French, Italian, Arabic, Hebrew, and Syriac. And as fate would have it, Chamberlain finds himself in a critical juncture, in a critical position, in a critical battle of Gettysburg. He is tasked with holding the high ground at the Little Round Top, which he does brilliantly with a 20th Maine. And if you watch Gettysburg, you'll see his other exploits with the captured, or with the so-called traitors. He is awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, in a second battle, or afterwards, I'll go back here, the Siege of Petersburg, Joshua Chamberlain is wounded hip through hip with a 50 caliber bullet. It ruptures his spleen, and for the rest of his life, he's left on the battlefield for dead. But for the rest of his life, he uses an artificial tin bladder, if you will, which is just archaic for our times, but lives to the age of 83. So the Union generals, this is really the part of the story that's most important. Who's next? So Union generals, it's really a matter of who's really leading here. And get this to scroll. Sorry about that. And here's the most important slide of this. And this is a quote from Lincoln here. If you don't want to McClellan, if you don't want to use the Army, I should like to borrow it for a while. So really, this is the important part of this. In this order, during the Civil War, we go from Scott to McClellan, and actually Lincoln takes over for a while with Secretary of War Stanton, which is unheard of. He rehires McClellan. McClellan organizes the Peninsular Campaign, which is an abject failure. Subsequent to that failure, he is fired. General Halleck is appointed and fired. General Burnside appointed and fired. Hooker, Meade, Gettysburg, and then after Gettysburg, Grant.